Shabbat shalom, everyone. It's
Shabbat
so
shalom.
fabulous to be with you on this balmy, warm, gorgeous February morning if you're in Florida. And if you're in New England, we're inside, so it's fabulous to be with you guys. Let's thank God for the gift of learning Torah together, and then want to just hear from Elias, who is back after a few weeks being in Argentina and quarantining. So be so good to hear from you. So let's thank Hashem first. Baruch atah Adonai
Eloheinu
melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
וערב נא אדוני אלוהינו את דברי תורתך בפינו ובפי עמך בית ישראל ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה ברוך אתה אדוני
המלמד תורה לעמו ישראל. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, שבחרבנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and Elias, it's so fabulous to have you back, and welcome home from Buenos Aires and from seeing your mother. So could you kind of just give us a report on how your mom is doing, how Buenos Aires is, and flying internationally in the age of COVID?
Thank you, Wes. Good morning, everybody. And it's so nice to be back. I have to say before I start going deep into that this trip helped me, thinking about the important things in life and what it's really deep and what it's really superficial. So I'm not longer going to talk about my socks on Talmud class, okay? Because I'm a changed man, although today it matches my tie. I don't know if nobody cares, but anyways, now into the deep stuff. So thank you for asking, Wes. I wouldn't recommend anybody to travel abroad in the middle of a pandemic. That's number one rule. So you probably heard my mom broke her hip in Buenos Aires, and I had to go and see her. I wanted to go and see her. And, it's challenging. It's very challenging. We see new life here happening with the COVID, and then a completely different reality is also at the airport. And this idea that you have to be with a mask completely all the time, only 10 or 15 minutes to take it off while you are eating. But then the rest of the time, from me door to door, 37 Westgate Road to where my mom lives is 20 hours, exactly 20 hours. Those 20 hours, you are perhaps, 19 hours and a half with a mask on. So obviously you cannot sleep on the plane because you're not breathing properly, and it becomes very long, very long. And the fascinating stuff, it's somebody can explain it, perhaps you, because you're such an expert in medicine and COVID. I went out to visit my mom. I had to quarantine, but then I had to break the quarantine in order to do a test to come back. So, everything is crazy. Everything is crazy. And, one thing that I realized in Buenos Aires is that the stores stopped selling scarves. Nobody's selling scarves anymore because the regular citizens use their mask as scarves. They don't cover their mouth. They put it here. So that's it. End of the scarves.
How is your mom doing?
My mom is doing well in terms of her. She's 100% mentally, and her mood is fine. Her mood is fine. Physically, obviously, it's a lot of challenges. She's not walking, and she has home care, 24 hours, all right? People who come and go in the house who help her with different things, and physical therapy, nurses, cooks, and everything, and, it will be a long recovery.
Last question, my dear friend. What was it like to leave your mom and come back?
You're into the easy questions today, my friend. Well, you experienced the same thing.
I did.
You experienced the same thing. I remember vividly when your mom was, in her late years, you would travel very often to Denver, back and forth. And it's really painful, because the idea that you have your life, 6,000 miles, away from your mom, it's your heart tears apart. And hopefully I'll be able to go back soon.
Well, lots of love to your mom,
Thank you.
Elias.
Thank you for asking me about
We really
this.
missed you, and it's so good to have you back.
Thank you.
So, dear colleagues, we got our work cut out for us today. Let me tee up the issue. It is said, I don't know who said this, but I've heard it from somebody else, that sometimes the Torah is a guide for how to live our lives. And sometimes the Torah is an unflattering mirror in who we actually are. And I think in our portion coming up today, Mishpatim, we're going to have beautiful and powerful examples of both. So last week we stood at Sinai and we got the Ten Commandments. This week we have the Mosaic Code in Mishpatim. It's a whole assemblage of different laws and ordinances and statutes. And what you'll see is that it's both a beautiful path to how to live your life. There's so much in this portion that is gorgeous and uplifting, and you read it and you say, yes, sublime, I want to build my life around it. But the first passages are a mirror that shows us an unflattering version of human nature. So, and we're going to look at both and how they reinforce each other and the creative tension between them. Last week at Sinai, God's first principle is Anochi Adonai Elohecha Asher Hotzeiticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim Mibeit Avadim. I, God, I am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So God's first move in the Decalogue is to identify God's self as anti-slavery. I am to use some terminology of today, I am the caste dismantler. I dismantle caste. You were in the original biblical caste. You were slaves. I took you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Okay? And what we're going to see today is that the very first law that the Israelites pass is when you acquire a Hebrew slave. Not if, but when. When you acquire a Hebrew slave. So the Israelites were slaves, and now they're free. And their very first law is to reenact a whole new caste system. When some Israelites own other Israelites, we're going to take a look at it, but it includes the fact that, and this is particularly horrific, and if you've studied at all slavery in the South, it's known, and also here, that from the enslaver's point of view, the enslaver, the slave owner, the womb of a female slave was a profit center, and the enslaver would breed the female slave so that those children would also become slaves. So now I have more slaves, more profit centers. And our first passage after Sinai deals with what happens when I'm an enslaver. I take the womb of my female slave, I breed her with another slave, and now this male slave has feelings for this woman and their children and doesn't want to leave, and deals with the subject of tearing families apart. So that is so. What we're gonna look at is how do we understand that? What does that say about human nature? Is it a problem, or maybe it's not a problem? If it is a problem, do we see contemporary echoes of this problem, and what do we do about it? So, Laura Dan Nessen, would you just read on page 1? I just wanted to ground us in the first principle in the Ten Commandments. I am the Lord your God. Or the Lord I am your God.
I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage.
Right. So that's God's orienting thing. Me'eretz Mitzrayim, Mibeit Avadim, from Egypt, from the house of bondage. And now you're going to start your own community. And let's take a look at it. So, Dan, pick up with page 3, and if you can just read the passage at hand, which permits slavery. These are the rules. We're on page 3, Dan.
Yeah. These are the rules that you shall set before them. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. In the 7th year, he shall go free without payment.
So, right. So that's just, right. That is just very jarring. Ki tikne eved ivri. When you acquire a Hebrew slave. So I just want to pause here. And then he's going to serve 6 years. And in the 7th year, he goes free without payment. And yes, we know that in Deuteronomy there's a similar law, but it's kinder. And yes, in Deuteronomy it's gentler. And yes, he gets furnishings and he gets some compensation. Yes, they're nicer to their slaves in Deuteronomy. But, and it's in the packet. But ki tikna eved ivri. So I want to pause there, double click. What does it say about human nature that a freed people, and like their defining experience is that they're a freed people from slavery, and their first move is not only to do slavery, but to enslave fellow Jews? What does that say about human nature?
There's some weird stuff going on, but this is, there's one way in which the Torah is saying that there's an end to slavery. When the Jews were slaves in Egypt, right, it was endless. One generation is born and dies, the next generation is born and dies, and they continue to be slaves. Here it says that, after 6 years, even though they get nothing, after 6 years it's over. So there's actually this kind of this idea that the Torah is, in a sense, being a little bit kinder to slaves, right?
And Dan, does that wash for you?
And the conditions were way better.
Possibly.
No, seriously.
Yeah.
The conditions were way better. This is like asking you, where do you prefer to spend your coronavirus a year? In America or in Argentina? The virus is there. You cannot get rid of it. But the conditions are better in one country than the other.
Yeah,
So,
and
but is that commensurate?
I'm not justifying. I'm
Dan,
saying what it was the norm in those days.
But
Yeah.
I'm asking, is that commensurate to the moral problem?
Well,
that
okay,
it was
so
shorter, that it was better, that it was nicer, a kinder, gentler slavery?
Right, but I just
So
wanna-
there's like a
let me just finish that. So
Yeah.
the other point I was going to make is that that you asked about human nature, and if we believe in that human nature is a development of evolution, then evolution creates the sense that there's always somebody at the top. There's always someone at the top, and that there are people at top. People at top, animal at top. If you look at any animals, they always have a caste. They have a caste system. There's if you know this with pack. Dogs are pack animals, and they're packs. So I'm sorry.
High school.
Yeah. Anyway, so there's always a sense that somebody's going to be better than somebody else. If we believe evolutionarily that this is how it happened, that it is indeed part of human nature. Do I like this? No. Is it a reality? I mean, if we all step back and say, there's so many times that I think about all the things that I do, and if I take it one half a step back and say, oh my God, what I just did was racist, but I didn't realize it. What I just did was dismissive of the person serving me because I wasn't actually polite to them. There's things that I do all the time that it just comes like that, and then I say, I really should have acted better.
But Dan, before and then Michelle and Elise and Elijah, I'm sorry, but I just have to say this, okay? It is true that human nature is caste system. High school, middle school, and it's animal nature, wolves, and any alpha male and all that stuff. Okay, here's my question though, Dan: isn't the Torah all about regulating human nature and making us our best selves? So, for example, the law right before this is envy. So it's human nature to envy. I want your house. I want your car. I want the nachas you have from your grandkids. Yada 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 yada. I want. It's human nature to fall into the comparison trap. And the Torah says, don't. Yeah, it's human nature, but don't do it. Transcend human nature. Don't envy. So why does the Torah here give in to our caste problem?
This is when Michelle gets to answer.
Okay.
No, I was so taken. You have pushed it much further since then, Dan, but I was so taken by your starting out your sentence saying it's weird, because it's not actually weird at all. In fact, it's very understandable that a people whose entire frame of reference had only been slavery would build a society in which there was slavery, and therefore the only move you could make at that time was an incremental move. The idea of smashing the idols is a really tough idea in a really tough place, and we see this often in family dynamics. Right? You grow up and you know how a family is supposed to work. And even if you didn't like the family that you came from, or you didn't like some of the things you got, you find yourself repeating I like my family, mom, dad, it's all good.
We all love our families.
Yes, but no matter where you are and whatever templates you have of negative behaviors, that's how you understand the world. And it's really tough to break free from it. And in fact, so these 6 years that they can make that incremental move in some senses to their credit, and in Deuteronomy later, where they're able to make, an even more significant move. They don't get it all. They don't get breaking the idols, but they do a little family therapy. And sometimes that's what we can do in that moment.
So if I hear what you're saying, Michelle, it's kind of like the truth that abuse and other patterns in family cycle, and kids live what they learn, and for better or for worse, what they inherit in their home, very often they perpetrate in the home they create. And that's what's going on.
I have a question for all of you, because
Yeah.
you are the experts. I'm an expert in socks. So in Egypt, everybody was a slave. Every Jew was a slave. Here it begins by saying, ki tikne, when? That means that not always was the case. And second, that means that some people were not,
Right.
the slaves, and they had money. Where did they get the money from? From Sinai?
They borrowed it. They borrowed it from their neighbors permanently.
Okay, thank you.
So-
Thank you for
Or their
clarifying
neighbors
that.
felt so
But
bad that
it's in-
they gave them reparations.
I know that your point is that it's a moral issue, but there are huge differences between an entire society being slaves, and here there are some changes.
Right, but the question I just want to shine the light on is, and I think what you're talking about with patterns and abuse and cycles, seems
And not just abuse, by the way. I mean, also a lot of the things we know. When you got married to Solomon, his family operates a little bit differently than your family of origin probably operates, and there are probably things where the two of you are like, wait, but that's not how it's done. You put the cutlery over here, right? It's tough to make a really extreme move. It's also even tough sometimes to make small moves within our lives. And what's so interesting about this is it's not coming from the people. It's actually coming from God. There's some sense in which God is holding them in a space where they can take in the information at the pace that they can deal with it.
okay.
I would also love to pop in because I really appreciate both what Michelle and Elias were saying. Also you, Dan. I don't happen to connect with that right
Lord
now.
Nelson.
But the distinction here is that these are not slaves that are enslaved as a result of hatred or prejudice, and they're not slaves that are enslaved as a design for the ideal working society. They are people who enslave themselves, who sell themselves into slavery because they've fallen on hard times. And so I think, to me, this story of slavery speaks more to our own inability to provide social nets that don't punish people who've fallen on hard times. That rather than these people are in a real compassion challenge, in that they have lost their sensitivity to suffering because of the extreme suffering that they've been under, and they're not able to create a world in which there isn't an underdog because of that trauma that they've lived with. And so God is saying, okay, I get that you're in a limited, you have a limited capacity to understand a world in which there doesn't have to be somebody suffering at the bottom. But if you are going to believe that you deserve to suffer, I'm going to tell you that that's a limited period. I'm going to tell you that your term of suffering is a limited term of suffering. And that's just, I think, a really different, right? Slavery in this country was all about seeing an entire people as permanently valueless, as permanently without dignity, as permanently deserving of suffering. And this is different. This is, I see myself, I didn't manage my stolen goods appropriately. I didn't manage my reparations appropriately, and therefore I'm on hard times and I deserve to suffer. They're different.
Yeah.
Which
So,
is
Elisa,
lovely.
I wanna just-
Wait. Have you ever considered doing public speaking?
Yes. Elisa, I want to just, I just want to put some, shine some light on what you just said, because what you're channeling Rashi. Now, what Rashi says, which reflects what you said, is not actually, does not seem to be the pshat at all. But let's just take a look at it. So turn to page 7, and Elisa, if you can just read the summary that the linear Rashi translation provides of it. And I want to talk about why does Rashi, we talked last week about why does Rashi say what Rashi says. Here's another Rashi, and let's look at it. This is Rashi on this whole 6-year slave business.
A Hebrew slave can be obtained when the court sells him for a theft for which he cannot reimburse the victim. He can also sell himself when he is destitute. In both of the above cases, he goes free after 6 years.
Right. So Rashi asks, answers the question why. What his answer to the question why slavery is it's a problem of economic inequality, and either somebody is a thief, and that's how they fall into slavery, or they are just fall in hard times, and that's why they fall into slavery. But in either case, it's term limited. So this is not Egyptian. This is not antebellum South. This is not deep caste system. This is not your permanent underclass. This is not India. This is not Nazi Germany. This is either a thief, so it's kind of like a system of restitution, or it's poverty, and it's a harsh way to feed himself, but it's time limited. Now, here's my question to you: why do you think Rashi reads it that way? Because it doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. Why does Rashi read it that way?
Well, it's evolution. How many centuries he lived after this?
He was 1040 to 1105,
right.
And this is 1200 BCE, so it's about.
So there are many centuries before, and also, actually, you put it. We will get there later. You added another text here in Re, all right?
Yeah.
That changes a little bit the laws as well.
Yeah.
But I think that in some ways it is the pshat of the text, because the text, you have all of these people who have recently been liberated. So there's no way, there's no mechanism for them to be enslaved. They've just been freed. They are inclined to follow God's teaching, even though they don't understand it, they're inclined to follow. So what is a situation in which this people, having just experienced suffering like that, would do that? I think actually here he's totally pshat. Now, I think for me, the problematic part of Rashi is we skip that a Gentile, that somebody who's not a Jew is enslaved forever. Now that's a really big and important distinction, in that we are totally cool with oppressing someone else, just not ourselves. And that, I think, if you're going to look at pshat, like, I'm also wondering, who are these Gentiles? Who are these non-Jews that they're oppressing for forever? We just came out of Egypt. It's just the Israelites. So why is Rashi bringing that in here?
And again, the text doesn't. The text doesn't. The text just talks about an Eved Ivri. I want to continue with the text, and I want to just put out there a question for you to think about. Okay, which is the exercise we're having now just a second iteration of the conversation we had in the spring about Thomas Jefferson and slaveholding, right? And you remember that, and Elias brought this up yesterday in our clergy chat. Maybe this is just like, the conversation we had in the spring about is Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and Thomas Jefferson and all the slaves he had, and George Washington and all the slaves he had. And then you run the question of, are we criticizing our forebears based on sensibilities that are developed much later or not? And I want to ask you, is that what's going on, or is a different thing going on, which is that this whole slavery business, it's not just that it violates our norms, but in fact it violates the Torah's own norms. It's inconsistent with the Torah's own values, not just from the first commandment, I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, but even more. So let's pick up, Elias, will you pick up with verse 3 and read the rest of that? If he came single, he shall leave single. We're on page 4. We're just reading the passage about slavery. Yeah. We're on page 4. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. In the 7th year, he shall go free without payment. And then keep going, verse 3.
If he came single, he shall live single. If he had a wife, his wife shall live with him. If his master gave him a wife, and she has borne him children, the wife and her children shall belong to the master, and he shall live alone.
So let's just pause here, because this is deeply problematic, right? Look at the footnote on page 4, the thing number 4. In the ancient Near East, it was common practice for a master to mate a slave with a foreign bondwoman solely for the purpose of siring houseborn slaves. The woman and her offspring remained the property of the master. So I just want to put out there, right? We're having an honest conversation. This is like horrible stuff. this is the Torah, permitting the womb of a female slave to be a profit center, right? And then it's dealing with the issue of what happens when human feelings arise. So if his master gave him a wife and she has borne him children, and the wife and the children shall belong to the master, and he, the slave, shall leave alone, right? So now the father of these slaves, it's his time to go, right? It's, he served 6 years, and now year 7, he should go free. The only problem is he actually loves this woman with whom he's had relations, and he loves their kids. Now, but if the slave declares, I love my master and my wife and children, that's already problematic. The first part of that just feels so counter to human nature. How would I love my master? That's just appalling, right? But we have to ask, why is the Torah even saying that? But if the slave declares, I love my master and my wife and children, that's real, that's human. I do not wish to go free. His master shall take him before God. He shall be brought to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl. He shall then remain his slave for life. Michelle, when we were talking about this during the week, you were talking about the trade-offs that this slave is put in. Could you talk about the trade-offs he faces?
I think the trade-offs are obvious. If here you are and either you love your wife and therefore you stay as a slave, or you go free and you have to leave your wife and your family. And so in some sense, to accept slavery is the natural human inclination. If you've found love here, therefore creating this whole group of people who will be perpetual slaves because of a sense of love. But at the same time, there is this articulation that we framed it earlier in my class this week as an act of courage, that he's able to choose love here, which is antithetical to the values of his community. And the richness there is in the Rashi that you brought on page 8, because there is this...
So you want to read that out?
Sure. In the case where he sold himself, the ear that heard on Mount Sinai, for me, are Bnei Israel servants, and he nevertheless went ahead and acquired a master for himself, should have to be pierced. Rabbi Shimon expounded this verse in a beautiful manner. Why are the door and doorposts different from the other objects of the house? God, in effect, said the door and the doorposts were witnesses in Egypt when I passed over the lintel and the 2 doorposts, and I said, for me are the Bnei Israel servants. They are my servants, not the servants of servants. And this person went ahead and acquired a master for himself, and therefore he should have his ear pierced in their presence.
I just hate this.
I love this.
Wes,
I love this.
I need to ask you a question, Wes.
Hold on just one sec, because this is such a transgressive act. What Rashi is saying, he has our problem. Rashi has our problem. How can it be that we've got slaves here at this time? It is directly antithetical to what happened at Sinai. The ear that heard at Sinai the message of you shall be slaves only to me now goes and makes yourself a slave. And Rashi's trying to reconcile that for himself. And in some way, as he reconciles it for himself, he realizes that ear that heard that somebody should make themselves a slave and make this choice, that yes, there is this possibility of it, but this Rashi feels to me, as I said to you earlier, almost like the Ben Sorer Morer Torah, in the sense of like, yes, it existed, yes, it was possible, but I just can't conceive that anybody would have taken it, that anybody would have taken God up on this offer. Like, yes, it's in the Torah, but this isn't how things in Israelite society work. It just can't be. That's what I hear from Rashi.
Let me just say why I hate this this midrash and this Rashi. The system that the Torah permits here puts this male slave in an impossible, untenable situation. He has to decide, what do I love more, my own freedom or my family? My freedom or my family? And as you pointed out in our clergy chat over the week, not only my freedom or my family, but my freedom and my family and my dignity. Because if I choose my family, if I don't want to leave my children, right? And by the way, if you read the testimony of slaves, or if you read Cass by Isabel Wilkerson, one of the most wrenching things is the sale of slaves so that family units were broken. and spouses had to leave each other, and parents had to leave children. That's the most wrenching thing. And in fact, the Civil Rights Museum in Alabama is built at the site. It's built at the site where they used to tear families apart, right? Can you imagine, God forbid, that you have to leave your sons. Imagine, God forbid, you have to leave your wife. I mean, this is horrible, horrible, horrible. And if a slave says, no, I don't want to leave my sons. I don't want to leave Mikey and David. I don't want to leave Lorraine. I'm not going to leave my family, right? Then, and you make the decision, I love my family more than my own freedom, then you get stigmatized with an all. And why I hate this midrash is that the system puts the slave in a morally impossible situation and then says, oh, you chose to be slaves to somebody else, not God. That's F you. No. The system made me. The system's telling me I either don't see my kids again, I don't see my wife again, or if I do see them, now I'm a slave. So that's what I have to do so that I can be a husband and a father. And now you're telling me that I'm dissed? No. The problem here is not the male slave. The problem is the system. And it's a moral problem. Now, before I want to just say one other thing, and then Elias, you're on. Here's why this is not a 21st century liberal, woke, progressive critique. It's not. The problem here is it's inconsistent with the Torah's own values. So the Torah says the following in this portion. It says, you shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And Rabbi Sachs, in his beautiful commentary, Judaism's Life-Changing Ideas, says that this is about commanding us to have empathy. And he writes as follows, based on those, you are strangers in the land of Egypt, therefore you are commanded to have empathy for strangers. And then he says, not only does it tell us to empathize with a stranger because you know what it feels like to be in his or her place, it even hints that this was part of the purpose of the Israelites' exile in Egypt in the first place. It is as if God had said, your sufferings have taught you something of immense importance. You have been oppressed. Therefore, come to the rescue of the oppressed, whoever they are. Whoever they are. You have suffered. Therefore, you shall become the people who are there to offer help when others are suffering. So, in other words, the Torah's own values here are convert your suffering into compassion. Just one last thing, and then Elias, it's yours. And so it is proved to be. There were Jews helping Gandhi in his struggle for Indian independence, Martin Luther King in his efforts for civil rights for African Americans, Nelson Mandela in his campaign to end apartheid in South Africa. An Israeli medical team is one of the first to arrive whenever and wherever there's a natural disaster today. So the Jewish value is we know what it's like to suffer, therefore have compassion for suffering, and therefore the notion that the Torah would create a system which tells a man you either have to give up your freedom or you have to give up your family, that is just outrageous. And I want to know, where's the outrage? Elias.
All right, first of all, I have to say, we don't want you to be so passionate about stuff. We need you healthy and and smiley and happy. So please, Wes, take the steam off. And so second, I agree pretty much everything you said. And I see your position here. I see it clearly, and who couldn't disagree with you? Now, I'm going to propose another view of it. So you said something about who can love his or her master, and that's outrageous. I don't think that is that outrageous, but bear with me with this thought. What happens if, in those days, the conditions of being a slave were so much better than being out there in the wilderness, where you have to look for your own work and your food and stuff? Now, do we know if the conditions of slavery were the conditions as we know them, with a chain and with labor in hard labor, or was it another different style of slavery? So what I'm proposing here is to see another twist in the text, which is there a possibility that the conditions as a slave were better than in the real world?
So on that, and I this has been, I think, an echo in conversations around slavery in this country and slavery in the Bible, and wanting to see it as more positive. throughout the halachic literature, slaves are a category of second-class citizens, and they're always labeled as such. And they are never, I mean, just in terms of prayer access, they never have the access to God. They never have the access to rights, and it's very clearly articulated. Women, slaves, and minors are all of the second-class citizens.
There's
so
a
I
dignity
think
issue.
there's a huge, but more than a dignity issue, it's also just unequal. So I think I would be less persuaded by that. I think one of the things I'm just really struck by reading this today is the distinction between Israelite slaves and non-Israelite slaves, in that the case that we're talking about the bondsman who doesn't want to leave his family, is somebody who's in love with somebody who's not Jewish, who's a foreign bondswoman. And so it's actually, to me, I have a real question of if this is not so much a commentary on the slave, but a commentary on wanting to enforce, miscegenation, that one of the ways that racism is perpetuated and has been perpetuated in this country and casteism all over the world is by preventing people from loving each other from across different backgrounds. And so this text is actually saying, like, if you love somebody who's different than you, you are punished and you are stigmatized. And I don't think it's about the slavery here. I think it's about miscegenation. It's about preventing bonds to be formed with other people. It's about preventing. We have lots of empathy for each other. We have lots of empathy for each other. And that interesting thing with, like, love the stranger in your midst, except have only empathy for your people, because you can't depend on other people. And that's, I think, where the trauma comes in, which is like, you can't trust other people. Everyone else hates Jews, but Jews love Jews. And so if you just love Jews, you're going to be okay. And so that, to me, is just, I'm really sitting with that challenge, in that I think we have a lot of, there still today exists a real bias against interfaith partnerships, against interrace partnerships. We don't want to acknowledge it. We want to pretend like it doesn't exist, but it's there. And just like this guy has to walk around with a mark on him and feels that, I think we have to be really awake to the ways in which many interfaith families feel like they walk in a Jewish community and they're seen like they have an awl in their ear. And what do we actually do to fight against? What are we going to take on? We see, fine, people fall in love. That's a they pick their partner. That's something that they get to choose. They get to choose, but there's a deeper level at which, right, this text is like, you don't choose your partner. Your partner chooses you, like your situation, your context. Like, people fall in love based on where they are, and we want to honor that, and we want to affirm that, and we want to make sure that everyone walks in a community and they're seen as equals.
Yeah, I really appreciate you picking out that gloss, because indeed the commentary shows us that, wait a minute, if it was an Israelite woman, she would also go free at 6 years. But I'm wondering then that if we see the role of God and tradition a little bit differently here, because in that sense, therefore, that is a bright red line in the ancient world that, again, the issue behind his staying a slave is that it's a transgressive act, and it's compounded by the transgressive act of going outside of his people.
Right, it's a transgressive act in its own context here, because he's choosing to affirm his role as a husband, and choosing to affirm his role as a father, and choosing not to leave his wife, and choosing not to leave his children, and that is deemed transgressive. But the fact that it's deemed transgressive is actually very troubling to me.
Yeah, but I think actually it's really interesting which eyes we choose to bring to this, right? Because if you bring it into the modern world, there is a sense in which, for all of us, the compassion of you love who you love, and just do that, fights against and yet we need to continue to carry on these mitzvot that we were given within a Jewish context, and that's always in constant tension. I think it's in tension here in this text.
So I want to just pivot in our last few minutes. I mean, it's such a complicated set of issues. Have compassion for the stranger, because you know what it's like to be a stranger, but you can enslave the Israelite who's suffering economically. We'll go with Rashi's, right? Rashi's position is he's hungry. He's suffering economically, and therefore my response is I'm going to enslave him for 6 years, and I'll have him have sex with one of my female bondswomen and put him in this impossible, untenable position. where's the compassion there? Right? I'm supposed to have compassion for the stranger, but for my own Israelite who's on hard times economically, going with Rashi's interpretation, where's the compassion? Here's my question. What is it's such a moral mess, such a moral murk. What's the message of this moral murk? And what is the contemporary resonance? Where do we see these kinds of clusters of issues in our time?
Right. So I was going to say this is actually as old as time, to use a phrase, right? If you go back to the Socratic forms, and I was thinking about that, and Yerushalayim shel Mala, Yerushalayim shel Mata, right? So we have the moral absolutism versus the reality, right? So it is just so ingrained, at a biological micro level in all of us that we believe in certain things. We can say, I believe in Yerushalayim shel Mala, that this is the way the world should be and has to be, and then this is the way that the world is. And so that the constant moral dilemma, and this is why we have the Torah. The constant moral dilemma is how do we take things that are just visceral and ingrained in us at a micro level biologically. How do we do that, and then also try to change that about who we are and what we are, and how does it resonate? It resonates in Socrates. It resonates in the Cabalists and the Montagues. When it's all through history that like connects with like, and every time that there's a variant of that it becomes problematic to the larger society, and then it hasn't changed. It doesn't change, and so by looking at the Torah, it's a way of just trying to find those ways in which we can take the broad moral dilemma, bring it down to almost like a one-on-one situation, and then how do we deal with the one-on-one?
Elias.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I agree with pretty much everything that we said here. I agree with everything.
Amen.
Yeah,
please
anyways,
please
no,
rise
but I wanna end on a positive note, and we didn't get to read the text of Albert Einstein and the great Marianne Anderson. By the way, interesting enough, you asked me about my mom. My mom's favorite all-time singer has been Marianne Anderson.
Wow!
And I grew up listening to her all the time with her records. Anyways, so there is something in our parsha today. Do I look like a rabbi? Yeah. So today's parsha. After Mishpatim, we are not going to read it here, but it says one thing, Exodus 23, Lo tihye acharei rabim leraot. Do not follow a majority to do evil. And that's what Einstein did. That's what Einstein did. He was based in Mishpatim.
Right. So, and the Einstein story, by the way, and it's in the packet on page 6, is just that he was he left Nazi Germany in 1932, just right before Hitler became chancellor. He's, of course, the smartest guy in the history of the world. So he's professor at Princeton with his wife. Marian Anderson comes and sings, and she cannot stay at a hotel in Princeton. And so he hears about this and welcomes her into his house. They create a deep connection. And even when Princeton Housing finally allowed black people to stay there, she would always stay at the Einsteins. And then he says, this is in Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, she quotes him, being a Jew myself, perhaps I can understand and empathize with how black people feel as victims of discrimination. That is what the Torah is talking about with the law that I read, which is you were a stranger, therefore have compassion for strangers. You were discriminated against, therefore have compassion for people who are discriminated against. Einstein embodied that, and what's so painful here is that somehow the Torah has a passage on slavery, which is the antithesis of that. Michelle and Elisa, bring us home.
So for me, I feel like that Rashi that you brought is so precious to me because it feels like Rashi was struggling with exactly what we were struggling with, that this doesn't line up with the Torah's own values. And in being able to put forward this idea that the ear who heard at Sinai would make yourself a slave, he understood, like, maybe there were economic reasons, maybe there were, I had gotten myself into trouble reasons, and that there's some level at which we need to find some way to repair that within our society, and slavery is not the best way, but maybe it's the only way, and therefore I can kind of wrap my head around it. But he is bringing the rest of the Torah against this one passage and saying we don't have to get hung up on the passages that hurt. That, in fact, we don't have to say, well, oh, the Torah says this, and therefore it stands for all time. That we can actually go back through it and to it and redeem the passages themselves by the values that surround them. And that perhaps if we bring pshat that is drash, we can ultimately come to a place where we understand that, yes, it may have been true that in that time, in that place, the only option available to them was the family option of what they knew, and therefore they recreated it. But it doesn't mean we have to continue to recreate it today.
I think one of the things I often think about is how change happens. And in the case of getting out of Egypt, God swoops in. The people are disempowered. Moses and God make a bunch of miracles, and then poof, their whole lives are different. And they never went through the process of coming up with what they wanted or mobilizing or feeling empowered. And I think that has consequences. I think when we organize, when we help others, it's really important to not come in and be the stronger power that's like, you just do this, or I'm going to do this for you, I'm going to fix this for you. It's really important to empower people. And I think that many of these conditions come as a consequence of the Israelites not having worked through what was wrong with their lives, what they wanted, how they wanted to mobilize, and what world they wanted to create. And so we're, I think, still suffering with that, right? Like, so many times we have one leader or two leaders or four leaders who have a clear sense of what should be, and a lot of people who aren't clear and aren't on the same page, and that leads to consequences.
And I would just end by saying what strikes me about Mishpatim is that we humans contain multitudes, and we contain absolute sublime qualities and horrible qualities at the same time. And I'm thinking about the disastrous offer that if you can find somebody who's 75, you can get your own vaccine, and how that has brought out the absolute worst in human nature. I have a Lexus. I'll see pictures of your grandkids. If only you'll let me take you. And the Torah seems to be alive to our capacity for sublime, have compassion on the stranger because you were a stranger. That's Einstein. And on our capacity for cruelty or for hard-heartedness. And we have both at the same time basically every day. We have the capacity for hard-heartedness and cruelty, and we have the capacity for incredible generosity and selflessness, both at the same time. And that's why the religious project is so important, to bring out our best version of ourselves. And that's just every day. That's just, if we draw breath, that's an everyday project for as long as we live. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.